Sunday morning, 1950. Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. The organ swells. Voices rise in hymn. And at the pulpit stands Adam Clayton Powell Jr., congressman, civil rights leader, and a man marked for death. Inside these walls, there is peace. There is faith. There is the warmth of 1,000 souls lifting their voices to heaven. The stained glass windows filter sunlight into pools of gold and crimson across the wooden pews. Mothers hold their children close. Fathers stand tall in their Sunday best. The elderly sit with hands folded, lips moving in silent prayer. This is sanctuary in its truest form. A place where the troubles of the world are meant to fall away, even if just for an hour. But outside? Outside in the streets of Harlem and beyond, forces of hate are moving, quietly, deliberately, with fire on their minds and violence in their hearts. Powell knows this. He's received the letters, dozens of them, the phone calls in the dead of night that wake him from restless sleep, the threats scrawled in blood-red ink promising to burn his church to the ground, with everyone inside. Some are signed, most are not. Some include crude drawings. Others contain biblical verses twisted into justifications for murder. But he stands at that pulpit anyway. He preaches courage. He preaches justice. He tells his congregation that they cannot bow to fear, that their ancestors survived worse, that their children deserve better. His voice booms through the sanctuary, commanding attention, demanding faith. What they don't know, what Powell himself doesn't yet fully understand, is that while he preaches about faith, someone else is already preparing to answer those threats. Not with prayers, not with speeches, but with something far more immediate, something far more dangerous. This is the story of the day Adam Clayton Powell Jr. walked into Bumpy Johnson's club, and 40 men walked out armed. To understand what happened, you need to understand Harlem in 1950. You need to understand the knife's edge that Black Americans walked every single day. This was not a safe place for Black Americans to speak their minds. Segregation was the law in much of the country. Jim Crow reigned in the South with an iron fist. In the North, discrimination was more subtle, but no less real. Integration was a battleground soaked in blood and rage. And those who fought for it? They made enemies. Powerful enemies with long memories and longer reach. Harlem itself was a paradox. On one hand, it was a cultural capital, home to artists, musicians, intellectuals, and entrepreneurs. The Harlem Renaissance had established it as a beacon of Black excellence. But on the other hand, it was a ghetto, overcrowded, under-resourced, neglected by city services and abandoned by law enforcement, except when that enforcement served to oppress rather than protect. Police protection for Black communities was unreliable at best. Officers would take their time responding to calls from Black neighborhoods. Sometimes they wouldn't come at all. At worst, the police were complicit in the violence against Black citizens. When racist organizations moved against civil rights leaders, the law often looked the other way. Or worse, it watched and did nothing. Sometimes it participated. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was one of the most visible targets in America. As the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist, one of the largest and most influential Black churches in the nation, with over 10,000 members, and as a sitting congressman representing Harlem, Powell wasn't just a voice for change. He was a symbol, a living, breathing challenge to white supremacy. And symbols, when they challenge power, become targets. His sermons didn't just inspire, they threatened the status quo. He pushed for desegregation in schools, in the military, in public spaces. He demanded fair employment practices. He called out discrimination in the defense industry. He named names. He called out injustice by its true name without euphemism or apology. And for that, he was hated by those who wanted the old order to remain. Powell had been beaten before. Arrested on trumped-up charges, followed by federal agents. His mail was opened. His phones were tapped. His every move was watched by those who wanted him silenced. But there was another kind of power in Harlem. A shadow power. One that didn't wear a badge or sit in Congress. One that operated outside the law but within a code of its own. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. But everyone called him Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was a crime boss. That much is undeniable. He controlled the numbers rackets, the illegal lottery that was one of the few ways poor black folks could dream of escaping poverty. He ran protection operations. He settled disputes. He enforced rules. And yes, he did all of this through violence when necessary. But he was not a thug. He was not some street corner hustler with a gun and an attitude. Bumpy Johnson was intelligent. He'd educated himself in prison, reading voraciously, studying strategy and philosophy. He was disciplined. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, maintained strict routines. He was strategic. He thought 3 moves ahead, always planning, always calculating. He controlled his territory not through random brutality, but through careful management. He maintained a kind of order in Harlem that the police either couldn't or wouldn't provide. He made sure outside criminals didn't prey on his neighborhood. He settled disputes before they escalated. He provided jobs, protection, and a sense of stability in a community the legitimate world had abandoned. His methods were outside the law. That cannot be denied. But his presence was, in many ways, a stabilizing force. Ask the people who lived in Harlem during those years. And many will tell you, Bumpy kept the neighborhood safe. Not from himself, he demanded his cut, he enforced his rules, but from chaos, from outside predators, from the kind of random violence that erupts when there's no authority at all. Powell and Bumpy existed in overlapping circles of Harlem power. They knew of each other. They'd crossed paths at community events, at fundraisers, at the social clubs where Harlem's elite, legitimate and otherwise, mingled. They respected each other from a distance. Powell knew that Bumpy kept order. Bumpy knew that Powell gave their community a voice in the halls of power. But their worlds rarely collided directly. Powell operated in the light. Bumpy worked in shadow. Until the threats became real. Threats against civil rights leaders were not abstract. They were not idle. They were not the ravings of isolated madmen. History had already shown what happened when hate turned into action. Churches had been bombed before. In Birmingham, in Montgomery, in small towns across the South. Homes had been burned. Leaders had been assassinated. Medgar Evers would be murdered in his driveway. Martin Luther King Jr.'s house would be bombed with his wife and child inside. Malcolm X would be gunned down in a ballroom. This was the reality of fighting for civil rights in America. You painted a target on your back. You made yourself a lightning rod for all the rage and fear of those who couldn't accept change. Powell knew this. He'd seen it happen to others. He'd attended the funerals. He'd comforted the widows and orphans. He'd stood in the rubble of bombed buildings and promised that the work would continue. And now, the threat had come to his door. Not just a threat against him. Powell had made peace with his own mortality long ago. No, this threat was different. This threat was against the church itself, against the congregation, against the innocent people who gathered every Sunday to worship. A credible threat, not just a letter from a lone crank with poor spelling and impotent rage. This was organized. coordinated, professional. Word had come through channels. Whispers from informants who moved between worlds, warnings from allies in the movement, intelligence from sources Powell couldn't name even if he wanted to, that a group of white supremacists planned to strike during Sunday service. They would burn the church, with the congregation inside. The plan, as Powell understood it, was brutally simple. Gasoline, multiple entry points. During the service, when everyone was inside and the doors were closed, trap them, burn them, make an example that would terrify every other black church in America into silence. Thousands of people, families, children, elders, all gathered in worship, all vulnerable, all trusting that their church was a safe place. Powell faced an impossible choice. Cancel the service? That would be surrender. It would tell every racist in America that fear worked, that violence worked, that black people could be silenced if you threatened them loudly enough. It would break faith with his congregation. It would make him a coward in the eyes of those who looked to him for strength. But proceed? That risked lives, not just his own. He'd accepted that risk the moment he entered public life, but the lives of innocent people who trusted him, who believed that coming to church on Sunday was safe. Mothers bringing their babies, grandparents who'd been attending Abyssinian for 50 years, children in their Sunday school clothes. How could he live with himself if something happened? If he let service proceed and the threat became reality? If families died because he didn't take the danger seriously enough? He considered official protection, police presence, federal intervention. But he understood the limits of that help. The local police were unreliable. Some were sympathetic to the very groups making the threats. Federal authorities moved slowly, bogged down in jurisdictional questions and paperwork. And a heavy police presence might escalate the very fear he was trying to combat. Armed officers surrounding the church would terrify his congregation. It would transform their sanctuary into a fortress. It would let the racists win even without striking a match. The congregation looked to him for strength, for certainty, for faith. They expected him to stand tall, to be unshakable, to trust in God's protection. But faith alone doesn't stop fire. Prayer doesn't deflect bullets or smother flames. Powell sat in his office late one night, long after his staff had gone home. The threat letters were spread across his desk. He read them again, analyzing the language, trying to determine how serious they were, trying to convince himself if they were just bluster. But he knew better. He'd been in this fight too long to dismiss threats as empty. And he realized something that night. Something that went against everything he'd built his life on. If official protection couldn't guarantee safety, then he needed unofficial protection. He needed someone who operated outside the rules, someone who understood violence and knew how to answer it, someone who had the power to make a threat disappear quietly, without headlines, without questions, without turning his church into a militarized zone. Someone who could protect his congregation without them even knowing they needed protection. He needed Bumpy Johnson. It's one thing to recognize the need. It's another thing entirely to act on it. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was a man of God, a leader of his people, a politician who'd fought his way into Congress against every obstacle the system could throw at him. His entire life was built on moral authority, on being above reproach, on representing the best of what Black America could be. And now he was about to ask a known criminal for help. The risk wasn't just physical anymore. It was political. It was spiritual. It was existential. If word got out that Powell had gone to Bumpy Johnson, if it became known that a congressman had enlisted the help of a gangster, his career could be over. His enemies would have exactly the ammunition they needed. They'd paint him as corrupt, as criminal, as no different from the mob bosses who ran the Italian neighborhoods. His reputation would be destroyed. Every piece of legislation he'd fought for would be tainted. Every speech he'd given would be viewed through the lens of hypocrisy. But more than that, there was the moral weight. Powell preached nonviolence. He believed in the power of faith, of law, of justice through legitimate means. He stood in the same philosophical space as other leaders who insisted that the movement must take the moral high ground, that they could not fight hate with hate, that they must be better than their oppressors. Turning to someone like Bumpy felt like a betrayal of those principles. It felt like admitting that the system couldn't protect them, that the law was a fiction, that violence was the only language that mattered. Powell wrestled with it, prayed over it, argued with himself through long, sleepless nights. He thought about turning the other cheek, about trusting in divine protection, about having faith that God would not allow his church to be destroyed. But then he thought about the children, the families, the elders. Were they supposed to die to prove his principles were pure? Was their blood the price of his moral certainty? He thought about what his enemies would say if he did nothing and people died. They'd call him reckless, arrogant. They'd say he valued his ego over the lives of his congregation. And he thought about what Bumpy Johnson represented. Yes, the man was a criminal, but he was also a protector of Harlem. He kept order when no one else would. He provided jobs when legitimate businesses wouldn't hire black workers. He settled disputes before they became blood feuds. Was Bumpy's violence somehow worse than the violence of the state? Than the violence of racist mobs? Than the violence of systematic oppression? Powell didn't have easy answers. The older he got, the more he understood that moral questions rarely came with simple solutions. In the end, the equation was brutal in its simplicity. If he did nothing, people would die. If he acted, they might live. The choice, when framed that way, wasn't really a choice at all. So one evening, quietly, without telling his staff, without informing his security, without leaving any record that could be traced back to him, Powell left his office. He walked through the streets of Harlem, past the brownstones and the corner stores, past the people who called out greetings, who wanted to shake his hand, who saw him as their champion. And he entered a nightclub. Not just any nightclub, Bumpy Johnson's club. The club was dimly lit, smoke hanging in the air like a physical presence. Jazz played low from a corner stage, real jazz, the kind you didn't hear on the radio, played by musicians who were too good for the commercial venues, but not commercial enough for the mainstream. The air smelled of cigarettes, whiskey, and expensive cologne. This was Bumpy's court, his kingdom, where he held audiences and made decisions that affected the entire neighborhood. And in the back, at a table positioned so he could see both the entrance and the exit, surrounded by men who moved with the coiled readiness of predators, sat Bumpy Johnson. He was impeccably dressed. Three-piece suit, perfectly tailored. Tie with a subtle pattern. Shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of discipline and control. He didn't look like the stereotype of a gangster. He looked like a businessman, which, in many ways, he was. He saw Powell enter. He didn't look surprised. Bumpy made it his business to know everything that happened in Harlem, and Powell's troubles were no secret to him. Powell approached. The conversation in the club didn't stop. Bumpy ran too professional an operation to let his business be that obvious. But people noticed. Eyes tracked Powell's movement through the room. The men around Bumpy tensed as Powell approached. These were serious men, dangerous men, the kind who'd done things that kept them awake at night, even though they'd never admit it. But Bumpy raised one hand, just a small gesture, almost imperceptible. But it was enough. The men backed off, created space. "Reverend Congressman," Bumpy said, his voice low and cultured. He gestured to a chair across from him. "Didn't expect to see you here. You lost?" There was no mockery in the question, just dry acknowledgement of how unusual this was. Powell sat. He was out of his element, and he knew it. But he'd come too far to back down now. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He explained the threat, the danger to his church, the specific intelligence he'd received about the planned attack, the limitations of official protection, the political impossibility of turning his church into an armed camp. Bumpy listened without interruption. He didn't take notes, didn't ask questions, just listened with absolute focus, his dark eyes never leaving Powell's face, reading him, measuring him, calculating whether this was genuine or some kind of setup. When Powell finished, there was silence. The jazz played on. Someone laughed at the bar. Life continued around them while these two men sat in a bubble of deadly serious conversation. Then Bumpy spoke. "Violence," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "is a last resort. I don't use it unless I have to. You understand that? I'm not some mad dog looking for excuses to hurt people." He leaned back in his chair. But protection, that's different. Protection is about making sure violence doesn't happen in the first place. It's about showing strength so you never have to use it. You make the other side understand that the cost is too high, that they're outmatched, that they should go find easier targets. He paused, studying Powell's face. "You want your people safe on Sunday. I can make that happen. But it has to be quiet. No police, no publicity, no credit. Nobody can know I was involved. Not your staff, not your deacons, not your wife. Nobody." Powell nodded. He understood. This had to be completely deniable. "And if something does happen?" Powell asked. "If they come anyway?" Bumpy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something cold and absolute. "It won't." There was a certainty in his voice. Not arrogance, not bravado, just certainty. The certainty of a man who understood power and knew how to wield it. The certainty of someone who'd been in this game long enough to know what worked and what didn't. Powell studied him for a long moment. This was the point of no return. Once he accepted this help, there was no taking it back. No pretending it hadn't happened. But those children's faces floated in his mind. The mothers, the grandparents, his congregation, his responsibility. They shook hands. The alliance was unspoken, unofficial, and deniable. But it was real. As real as the threats, as real as the hate, as real as the violence that had already claimed too many lives. Powell stood to leave, but before he reached the door, Bumpy spoke again. "Reverend, you preach about faith, about justice, about nonviolence. That's good. That's important. The community needs that." He paused. "But while you're preaching, somebody needs to be watching the doors. That's what I do. You handle the light, I'll handle the shadows." Powell nodded and walked out into the Harlem night. The moment Powell left, Bumpy's entire demeanor changed. The philosophical contemplation disappeared. The businessman vanished. What remained was the strategist, the tactician, the man who'd survived decades in one of the most dangerous professions in the world by always being smarter, always being more prepared than everyone else. He didn't waste time. Within an hour, he'd made a dozen phone calls. not from the club. Bumpy was too careful for that. He went to different locations, used different phones. Never stayed in one place long enough for anyone to track. He called men he trusted. And trust, in Bumpy's world, was a rare and precious commodity earned through years of loyalty and proven competence. He called veterans, men who'd fought in World War II, who'd stormed beaches and fought through jungles, only to come home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. These men knew discipline, knew how to follow orders, knew how to stay calm under pressure. He called enforcers, men who'd proven themselves in the violent chess game of Harlem's underworld, who understood that violence was a tool to be used surgically, not a tantrum to be indulged. He called community protectors, men who genuinely cared about Harlem, who'd grown up in these streets, who had families of their own, who might attend that church. Men who would fight not for money, but for principle. This wasn't a gang mobilization. This wasn't dozens of criminals looking to bust heads. This was strategic, calculated, precise. Bumpy was clear with his instructions to each man. No reckless action, no unnecessary violence, no alcohol before the operation, no drugs, no showing off, no machismo, pure professionalism. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was deterrence. Make the threats see that they were outmatched. Make them understand that coming to Harlem, threatening that church, would not go unanswered. Show them that every advantage they thought they had, surprise, racial intimidation, the expectation that black people wouldn't fight back, was gone. He assembled 40 men, each one handpicked, each one told exactly what was expected, each one given a specific position and specific rules of engagement. They would position themselves around the church, not inside. Powell had been clear about that. The congregation must not see them, must not know. The goal was protection without fear. But outside they would be everywhere. On rooftops with sight lines to approaching vehicles, on corners where they could intercept anyone approaching on foot, in cars positioned to block exits and create choke points, watching, waiting, ready. Each man was armed, not with cheap Saturday night specials, but with serious weapons. Bumpy made sure of that. He also made sure each man knew how to use what he carried. There would be no accidents, no nervous fingers on triggers, no collateral damage. The rule was simple. Powell would never know the details. The congregation must never feel fear. If everything went right, nobody would know anything happened at all. That was the plan. Silence as strategy, presence as power, the threat of violence as a shield against actual violence. Bumpy spent Saturday organizing, checking positions, making sure everyone knew their role, making sure there were backup plans and backup plans for the backup plans. By Saturday night, everything was in place. 40 men waiting, 40 men ready. And Bumpy sat in his office, going over the plans one more time, trying to think of any angle he'd missed, any weakness the enemy could exploit. He found none. But he kept looking anyway. Because that's what kept you alive in this business. Paranoia, preparation, never assuming anything would go according to plan. Sunday morning arrived. Sunday morning. The sun rose over Harlem, painting the brownstones in shades of gold and amber. Families stirred. Children were dressed in their Sunday best. The smell of breakfast cooking drifted from open windows. Inside Abyssinian Baptist Church, the service began as it always did. The organ played the opening hymn. The choir assembled, their voices rising in praise. The sanctuary filled with people, thousands of them, every pew packed, people standing in the back, the balcony full, and Clayton Powell Jr. stood at the pulpit, looking out at his congregation. He'd barely slept. The weight of what he'd done, the deal he'd made, pressed on him like a physical force. But he couldn't show it. Couldn't let them see his fear or his doubt. So he preached. He preached courage. He preached faith in the face of adversity. He spoke about their ancestors who'd survived slavery, who'd endured Jim Crow, who'd built this church and this community with their own hands and their own sacrifice. His voice was steady, strong. It boomed through the sanctuary, commanding attention, demanding faith. "We will not be moved," he declared. "We will not bow to fear. We will not surrender our dignity or our rights or our humanity because someone threatens us with fire." And he meant every word. Whatever compromises he'd made in private, whatever deals with devils he'd struck, in this moment he believed what he was saying. Had to believe it. Because if he didn't, what was any of it for? But outside, in the streets surrounding the church, another kind of protection was in place. Men in dark coats, positioned on corners, leaning against buildings, sitting in cars. To anyone passing by, they looked like ordinary Harlem residents. Maybe church members arriving late. Maybe people waiting for family. Nothing unusual. But if you knew what to look for, if you understood the language of the streets, you could see it. The readiness, the alertness, the way their eyes constantly scanned, the way they positioned themselves with clear sight lines and quick access to cover. 3 blocks away, in a diner, Bumpy Johnson sat drinking coffee. He had men positioned throughout the area reporting to him. If anything happened, he'd know immediately. And then they came. A convoy of cars. 4 of them. American-made sedans, the kind that working-class white men drove. Moving with purpose, not speeding, that would attract attention, but not slow either. Inside those cars, men with gasoline, with matches, with guns. With hate hardened into certainty. They'd planned this, rehearsed it. They knew exactly what they were going to do. They'd picked this church specifically because it was a symbol, because burning it would send a message that would echo across the country, because Powell was too visible, too bold, too successful, and someone needed to put him in his place. They'd picked Sunday morning because that's when the most people would be inside. The more casualties, the better the message. They approached the church from different directions, planning to converge simultaneously. They expected no resistance. Black churches didn't have security. Black people didn't fight back against white violence. That was the unspoken rule. That was how it had always worked. But as they got closer, as they turned onto the streets surrounding Abyssinian Baptist, they saw something that made them slow, that made them hesitate. They saw the men, 40 of them. No, more than that. It seemed like every corner had someone watching, every doorway had someone waiting. And these weren't scared churchgoers. These were hard men, dangerous men. Men who stood with a confidence that came from experience, from training, from knowing they were prepared for whatever came next. The lead driver in the convoy slowed, stopped. His passengers leaned forward, trying to understand what they were seeing. No one drew a weapon, not yet. No one shouted. There was no confrontation. But the message was clear, unmistakable. Written in the language of violence that both sides understood perfectly. You are not welcome here. You are outnumbered. We know why you came. We're ready. And if you proceed, this will not go the way you planned. You might succeed. You might burn the church. But you won't walk away. Not all of you. Maybe not any of you. Are you willing to die for this? One of the men in the cars, the leader probably, made a calculation: cost versus benefit, glory versus survival. The convoy sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. The men outside didn't move, didn't threaten, just stood there, watching, waiting, making it clear that the choice was the convoy's to make. Proceed and face the consequences, or leave and live. The lead car's engine revved. For a moment it seemed like they might proceed anyway, might decide that their mission was worth the cost. But then, slowly the car turned. The convoy followed. They didn't speed away. That would have looked like fear. They drove at a normal pace, casual, as if they'd simply made a wrong turn. But they left. They drove away from Abyssinian Baptist Church, away from Clayton Powell Jr., away from the thousands of innocent people who'd gathered to worship. Inside the church, Powell continued preaching. The congregation sang, prayed, celebrated, and they never knew how close danger had come. Never knew that outside their sanctuary, in the streets of Harlem, a silent battle had been fought and won, without a single shot being fired. The service ended peacefully. Families left through the front doors into the sunlight. Children laughed and played on the steps. The elderly moved slowly, carefully down the stairs, greeting friends they'd known for decades. Powell stood at the church doors as he always did, shaking hands, embracing his congregation, listening to their concerns and their joys. And as far as they knew, it had been a normal Sunday. Perhaps a particularly powerful sermon, but otherwise unremarkable. That was exactly how it was supposed to be. By the time the church emptied, Bumpy's men had already dispersed. They'd melted back into Harlem as quietly as they'd assembled, back to their regular lives, their regular routines, as if nothing had happened, because nothing had happened. That was the point. Later that afternoon, in a quiet moment, Powell learned what had happened. Not all the details. Bumpy made sure of that, but enough. A phone call, brief, cryptic to anyone who might be listening. The problem solved itself, was all Bumpy said. They won't be back. Powell sat in his office, holding the phone long after the line went dead, trying to process it all. Relief. Gratitude. And yes, a lingering sense of moral ambiguity about the means, even as he celebrated the end. They met again a few days later, briefly, quietly, in a Harlem cafe at a time when it was nearly empty. "You preach peace, Reverend," Bumpy said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I just make sure nobody interrupts." Powell nodded. There were no thanks, no public acknowledgement, no debt that could be recorded or traced. Just mutual understanding between two men who'd done what they thought was necessary. "What if they come back?" Powell asked. Bumpy smiled slightly. It wasn't a warm smile. "They won't. Word spreads. They'll tell others what they saw. That Harlem isn't soft. That coming here has consequences. That'll be better protection than me posting men every Sunday for the next year." He was right. The convoy members would talk, would tell their friends in other supremacist organizations, would describe what they'd seen. And that description, 40 armed men, calm and ready, willing to die to protect that church, would do more to deter future attacks than any number of police patrols. Nothing had happened, because everything had worked. Powell never preached about that Sunday, never referenced it even obliquely, never thanked Bumpy publicly or acknowledged what had been done, because that was the agreement. Silence protected everyone involved. Powell's reputation remained intact. Bumpy stayed in the shadows where he operated most effectively, and the church stayed safe. Did this event actually happen exactly this way? Officially, no. There is no record of it, no documentation, no headlines, no police reports, no FBI files that mention it specifically. But in Harlem, in the oral history passed down through generations, the story is told. Quietly, respectfully, in barbershops and family gatherings, in the coded language the communities use to preserve truths that can't be spoken openly. Ask the old-timers who remember those years. Some will say yes, it happened. Some will say they heard about it from someone who was there. Some will say it's a legend, a parable, a story that captures the truth even if the specific details are embellished. And maybe that ambiguity is intentional. Maybe the power of the story lies precisely in its undocumented nature. Because if there's no proof, there's no liability. No one can be prosecuted. No one can be condemned. The protection remains in place even decades later. What is documented is this: Adam Clayton Powell Jr. continued his work. Continued preaching, continued fighting for civil rights, and Abyssinian Baptist Church was never attacked, never burned, never targeted successfully, despite being one of the most visible symbols of Black power and progress in America. What is documented is that Bumpy Johnson was known for protecting Harlem, for keeping outside threats away, for maintaining a kind of order that the official authorities either couldn't or wouldn't provide. What is documented is that Black communities during segregation often survived through informal networks of power, through relationships that existed outside the law because the law had failed them, through protection that came not from police badges, but from community bonds. The broader truth is this: when the law fails to protect you, you find other ways to survive. When the system is designed to oppress you, you build parallel systems. When violence threatens your community, you meet it with the credible threat of violence in return. History doesn't always record what stayed hidden. Archives don't include the conversations that happened in the shadows. Official documents don't capture the unofficial arrangements that kept people alive. But that doesn't mean those things didn't happen. It just means they were too dangerous to document, too politically sensitive to acknowledge, too morally complicated to discuss openly. So who is the real protector? The man who preaches courage from the pulpit? Or the man who stands ready in the shadows so that courage can be preached safely? The answer, perhaps, is both, and neither. Because protection is never that simple. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. fought for civil rights with words, with laws, with faith. He believed in the power of moral persuasion, in the arc of history bending toward justice, in the possibility of changing hearts and minds. And those things matter. They're essential. Without leaders like Powell, without voices demanding justice, without the moral framework that said discrimination was wrong, the civil rights movement would have had no foundation. But Bumpy Johnson understood something else. He understood that while you're waiting for hearts to change, you still need to survive. That while you're bending that arc of history, someone needs to make sure you live long enough to see it bend. That faith is beautiful, but force is sometimes necessary. He fought with presence, with the unspoken certainty that some threats must be answered not with speeches, but with strength, with the willingness to stand in harm's way, so others never had to know how close harm came. Bumpy Johnson was not a hero. He was not a saint. His life was built on crime, on violence, on breaking the law. He hurt people. He profited from desperation. He was, by any conventional moral standard, a bad man. But he was not a monster either. He was a man who understood the reality of power, who accepted that the world was often unjust and responded to that injustice in the ways available to him. who protected his community with the tools he had, even if those tools were morally compromised. And on that Sunday in 1950, those two kinds of power came together. Quietly, briefly, effectively. The light and the shadow, the pulpit and the street. The preacher and the gangster. The congregation was safe. The church stood. The service proceeded without interruption, and peace survived. Not because the threat disappeared, not because the racists had a change of heart, not because the system protected them, but because someone stood ready. Because 40 men positioned themselves between innocence and violence. Because Bumpy Johnson made a calculation that the cost of attacking that church was too high. Because someone stood ready so others never had to know. Oh, that's the real legacy. Not the documented history, not the official record, but the quiet understanding that survival sometimes requires uncomfortable alliances. That protection sometimes comes from unexpected places. That the world is more complicated than our moral categories allow. Clayton Powell Jr. went on to serve many more years in Congress. Bumpy Johnson went on to control Harlem for another decade. The two men rarely crossed paths again. Their worlds remained separate. But on that Sunday morning in 1950, their worlds aligned. And because of that alignment, thousands of people went home safely to their families. Children grew up. Elders lived out their years. The church that had been targeted for destruction continued to stand as a beacon of hope and faith for decades to come. Sometimes that's what protection looks like. Not dramatic, not glorious, just people going home safely. Just normal life continuing when it might have been interrupted by tragedy. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything.